Welcome and hello. I'm Leila Nilipur, copywriter for the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, and I'll be your host for today. I'm very pleased to see so many of you joining us online for the American Women of Science Recovering History, Defining the Future Virtual Symposium Day 2. Today we'll focus on women in biology. First, we'll hear from pathbreaking women scientists from the Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute that were instrumental in creating the field of conservation biology. Then we'll hear from an interdisciplinary panel of women scientists about the hurdles they've had to overcome during their careers. The next session will consist of 4 lightning talks by current and former Smithsonian interns who describe the research they conducted as interns and how their internship shaped their career paths. Our last panel will highlight women scientists from the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute and those who were instrumental in helping them overcome gender-related discrimination in order to succeed. After today's virtual sessions, we'll have a networking event at the end of the day. Registration for the networking event is required and will close in 30 minutes. So if you haven't done so, register now on our Eventbrite. The link is on this webpage. Before we begin the symposium, I'm going to go through a few details about how this will all work. First, we are recording this session, and the recording will be made available afterwards to all members. We are also offering live closed captioning of this event, which you can enable on the bottom bar. This program is being conducted in listen and view only mode, which means your audio is muted and camera is disabled. And now, I am so pleased to introduce our first panel, Pathbreaking Female Conservation Biologists at the National Zoo and Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. Let's watch that now.
Hello, I'm Kate Kristen. I'm an environmental historian at Smithsonian. And I'd like to welcome you to our panel, Pathbreaking Female Conservation Biologists at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, also known as SCBI. Our panel is co-organized by 2 of our pathbreakers, Kathy Rawls and Janine Brown, and by the 2 moderators, myself and Rob Fleischer. We're also all longtime colleagues from SCBI. Thanks to Zach Johnson, my Smithsonian intern, for all his help with our panel and PowerPoint. In the past many decades, conservation science has evolved into a major area of biological science research and practice. Smithsonian's National Zoo and its Conservation Biology Institute, or SCBI, has been astride this growth from the earliest decades across the gamut of conservation biology research, including captive animal management and husbandry, ecology, reproductive biology, wildlife monitoring, genomics, nutrition, and behavior. Within conservation science, some women, such as Jane Goodall, have become well known around the world. While women scientists at SCBI have made profound contributions to conservation science all along, we think their roles have not been heralded widely enough. Today, we remedy that somewhat by exploring the contributions of 4 eminent, talented female NZP SCBI scientists who are or were trailblazers and leaders in their fields. Collectively, these women made their contributions to the National Zoo, also known as NZP, as I just mentioned, and the conservation community from 1972 to the present day. 2 of them, Dr. Janine Brown and Dr. Catherine Rawls, are here today on this Zoom panel, as you see again in that slide. Sadly, the other 2, Dr. Deborah Kleiman and Dr. Jo Gail Howard, are no longer alive, but we hope by panel's end, we will have made you feel familiar with and appreciative of the dynamic work and influences all 4 have provided to the formation of today's conservation science and to younger generations of women in these areas of study. First, some very brief tiny biographies, following the orders of the photos in this slide. At far left, Catherine Rawls, was born in California and educated at Stanford, Radcliffe, and Harvard. She was the fourth scientist hired at the National Zoo in 1976. Rawls' early papers on scent marking and sexual dimorphism in mammals have been widely cited. She is still publishing on both subjects. Her pioneering research on inbreeding problems in zoo animals led to the methods now practiced globally for genetic and demographic management of captive wildlife populations. And these works led to her interest in conservation. Rawls is also known for her field research, including on San Joaquin kit foxes and sea otters. She's advised many government agencies on endangered species and has received a plethora of awards from professional organizations. To Kathy's right, in the picture here, Janine Brown was born in Southern California and received a Master's of Science and PhD from Washington State University, majoring in animal sciences at a time when 90% of the graduate students were male. Janine was hired by the National Zoo and SCBI in 1991 and soon established the world's most productive endocrinology laboratory, developing dozens of assays to measure hormones in a variety of biological samples to assess reproduction, health, and welfare. Her creation of the first wildlife endocrine diagnostic laboratory has led to dramatic improvements in management of dozens of species, most notably elephants, on which she is a world authority. To date, 80% of Janine's trainees have been women. Many now lead research programs around the globe. Second to right in our array of 4 photos is Jo-Gail Howard, born in Texas, who received her DVM, her veterinary degree, from Texas A&M University. In 1994, she was hired by the National Zoo and SCBI as a theriogenologist. She is remembered as one of the world's greatest wildlife veterinarians who earned the nicknames Sperm Queen and Nature's Matchmaker because of her pioneering work in the development of assisted reproductive techniques that were key to the conservation of numerous species, including the black-footed ferret, a species down to its last 18 individuals by the 1980s. Jo-Gail was tireless in her search to unlock the mysteries of animal reproduction, and she passed that enthusiasm on to countless trainees and colleagues. And in the photo on the right, Deborah Kleiman was born in New York City and educated at the University of Chicago and the University of London, receiving her PhD in 1969. She was the second scientist, male or female, hired at the National Zoo in 1972, and is best known for having spearheaded an unprecedented international effort to save the endangered golden lion tamarin, a small golden-furred primate in Brazil's dwindling Atlantic coastal rainforest. Kleiman's main interests were animal behavior, reproduction, and conservation. She served as head of the National Zoo's Department of Zoological Research for over 15 years. Always, she was outspoken about the need to support early career women in a male-dominated institution. So we will shortly share with you a mini film festival featuring these 4 women scientists at SCBI, and then finish out with an all too brief set of questions and discussion with Kathy and Janine. And we hope that this together helps identify pathways and factors that allowed their success, forge novel areas of research, and sometimes at least bypass obstacles that came in their way. And the National Zoo, formal research at the National Zoo began in 1965 when mammologist John Eisenberg started the scientific research department there, quickly building a group of outstanding scientists, 2 of them women, Deborah Kleiman and Catherine Rawls. And he also put into play the acquisition and development of the Conservation and Research Center. You're seeing a landscape view of it towards the center here. That was called CRC, Conservation and Research Center. It's a large facility in Front Royal, Virginia, dedicated to breeding and researching endangered animals. Here you see the veterinary hospital at CRC under construction in the 1980s. After Eisenberg departed to academia, Deborah Kleiman took over as head of what became that Department of Zoological Research. And within CRC, also a reproductive biology division began in the veterinary unit. And by the early 2000s, all of this emerged as the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, the name it holds today. And today, the scientists in SCBI cover a gamut of research, which I've mentioned, the captive animal management, husbandry, ecology, et cetera. And the unit's known for its high level of collaboration, and this teamwork approach often leads to novel scientific discoveries and more effective conservation methods that save species. So first, in our mini film festival that we will now be showing, Kathy Rawls.
I remember when applying to graduate school, I was reading the catalog of Princeton, and it sounded like they had a really good program and really good, and then I got to the end and it said only men could apply. I mean, so it was that kind of thing. It was just, and I ended up going to Radcliffe, and Radcliffe didn't have its own faculty, they just sent you to Harvard, and they had a quota, so Radcliffe was allowed to send, I think, maybe 3 women a year to the biology department at Harvard. That was done by Mary Bunting, who was the president of Radcliffe at that time, and she said essentially like, well, everyone in Cambridge, Massachusetts understands that Radcliffe is Harvard. But, you know, there's a greater world out there, and they may not know this. I mean, these young women are going to be applying for jobs at like the University of Illinois and places like that where they may not know that Radcliffe is Harvard. And look right here, you get paid more if you have a degree from Harvard than if you have a degree from Radcliffe. And these young women are doing the work, so I think the degrees ought to say Harvard. So I came out with one of the first women that had a degree in biology that said, PhD that said Harvard. They hadn't quite adapted to this yet, because I remember at the commencement ceremony, I was welcomed, now that I had a PhD from Harvard, I was welcomed in the community of educated men. I just say do what you want to do. I mean, that was successful to me. I didn't get a job for many years, you know, but I ultimately did, and you really can't plan it out, and you never know what's going to happen. You just have to take advantage of the opportunities that come along, and you know, I certainly didn't stay with my thesis topic for the rest of my career, and I've actually had many periods, like Picasso, you know, my captive breeding period, my sea otter period, my sexual dimorphism period. And also I would say there's no convenient time to have a baby. It's certainly really easy when you're young physically, and then if you wait till after you have tenure or something, then you don't have nearly the energy. I guess the thought is maybe you have enough money you can hire help. But it's been an important part of my life. I'm glad I did it. I had my children.
So that was Kathy Rawls. Next is Janine Brown.
When I started working for the zoo about 30 years ago, there hadn't been a lot of hormone studies being done in wildlife. And I found out there was virtually nothing known about the biology of elephants. You've known me for 30 years. I've known you about as long as I've known most of the people in my work, longer. It's very difficult to ask an animal, you know, are you happy? Do you have good welfare? Because there are very few ways of looking at that. The work we do in the endocrine lab is we've developed a number of assays to monitor things from reproduction to health, looking at some hormones that are actually considered happiness hormones like oxytocin, so that we can study all aspects of an animal's life. Any biologist would love to know that all elephants were free-ranging in the wild, but the fact is their habitats are being destroyed. Humans are encroaching into their territory. There's a lot of human-elephant conflict. So our captive populations are turning out to be a very important insurance population. There are fewer and fewer elephants in the wild, and so if we don't have a healthy, sustaining population under human care, those countries are not going to have any elephants at all. I started going over to Asia and realized that the captive elephant populations over there also were not breeding very well. We established an endocrine lab at the Chiang Mai University, and they've started doing the same thing that we're doing. Now we have a fair population explosion on some of those camps over there that are actually using our tools. I am optimistic that we're going to figure out what needs to be done for elephants. The governments now are really starting to pay attention to the problems that are facing their native species. So I'm seeing a lot of movement in a positive direction. And I think we're going to be at the forefront so that when the opportunity does come to start reestablishing populations, we're going to know a lot better how to do it.
We just heard from Janine Brown. The next video features Jo Gail Howard.
I'm Dr. Jo Gail Howard at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute at the National Zoo. I'm a theriogenologist, and I focus on carnivore reproduction and to understand the biology of carnivores, and especially felids, and focusing lately on clouded leopards, and to try to understand especially their reproductive biology to maintain genetically healthy populations in zoos and in the wild. I grew up in Texas and went to vet school at Texas A&M and came to the National Zoo in a new program, a new training program for veterinarians to learn to do research and to try to understand the biology and reproductive physiology of these animals. And I was really amazed how little was known about animals. And this was not that long ago, and then the breeding programs would put a male and female together. If they didn't breed, they would try another male. And I was shocked at how little, information we had and how little help we could give. I just thought we could take some of this technology that's used in human infertility and start applying it to endangered species like artificial insemination and in vitro fertilization or test tube fertilization. But before we could do anything high tech like that, we had to understand the biology of these species, and that wasn't understood until we started studying them. The clouded leopard is one of the 36 wild felids we have. I'm focusing on clouded leopards lately because it's one of the most difficult cat species to understand and also to breed in breeding programs. So we always have had the problems of clouded leopards having severe male aggression and males killing and fighting with females, and so it's hard to have a breeding program with that behavioral aggression. So we've been really interested in understanding what makes them aggressive and how we can combat that problem. We've learned in our recent years studying them at the Conservation Biology Institute and also in our program in Thailand, where we have very genetically valuable animals left, and just how to get them together, how to create breeding pairs. And it ended up that if we could put cubs together at a very young age, even 6 to 9 months of age, and pair them up that early, and they literally grow up together, then that stops the male aggression. And it's really turned around the breeding program in the United States and also in Thailand. The world is really very integrated and connected, and if we lose this species, that means we probably lose other species in the forest. We may lose the forest altogether. And it will affect the human race eventually. And I think most people just want to be able to see these animals, want their future generations to see these animals, and they're unique, and nothing's going to replace a clouded leopard.
And Deborah Kleiman, our last film in the film festival.
I never stepped back. I was the first woman scientist hired in the U.S. in a zoo. And at the time I was hired, there wasn't even a single female keeper at the zoo, much less a scientist. The zoo community in 1972 was very male, and it remained very male for a long time. And so the efforts I was making, not only, was I going up against zoo tradition at the time by trying to push towards greater collaboration and cooperation and sharing of information. So both trying to push change in that area, as well as being a woman trying to push change in that area, was pretty difficult. One of the areas where I feel I've contributed a lot is in creating a kind of multidisciplinary approach to problem solving, so that we look at a problem and we say, okay, we need this discipline or that discipline, and then we look for someone to come and collaborate with us. And so what you have is a network of people at very different levels, I mean, from full professors to students, who have worked on this project at various times and not only contributed their expertise, but saw how you can have a successful project with a lot of different people, with a lot of different personalities, and a lot of different personality quirks, and how you can make it work. I got involved with Gold Line Tamarins because I was interested in the sociology of monogamy in mammals. And I'm also interested in human sociology. And so one of the more interesting things is seeing how you can get such diverse people to work together, and how you can get cultures to work together. And I think this program that is one of the longest that shows the benefit of integrating basic and applied research for a conservation outcome. It's also one of the few programs where the science that was done was occurring in a captive situation as well as in a field, and that captive field integration was important in developing the management applications to conserve the species. And of course, you know, Gold Line tamarins could go extinct. It's possible, but the likelihood now is so much less than it was when we started, when it looked clear that they would go extinct. I really appreciate the opportunity to be a mentor. I think that it's important, not only for women, but I think we need more scientists and conservationists that will act as mentors, both, you know, here in the U.S. and overseas. I think we're done.
And as Deborah said, I think we're done with that part of the event, and then we will go on to the questions in a moment. So we're going to start with a lightning round. And Kathy, I'm actually going to ask you a question first. Simply, what was the most important thing that you've accomplished in your scientific and conservation career?
Well, I think it was the initial discovery of that zoos had big inbreeding problems, and that the inbred offspring were dying at much higher rates than those that weren't inbred. And that just developed into genetic and demographic management of zoos worldwide. And we moved on to management of fragmented wild populations, and have just done a couple of textbooks on that. So it all started with that first discovery of inbreeding problems in zoos.
So in captive populations in zoos, and then in the wild. And would you have a thought about the same question regarding Deborah? Do you think it was bringing back golden lion tamarin populations in the wild? Or?
Oh yeah, she figured out how to breed them in captivity was the first thing. They were going extinct both in the wild and in captivity. And so she got them going well in captivity, and then she turned her attention to habitat and moving genetically valuable animals from the zoo to the wild and so forth.
Rob?
Okay. Janine, you're fortunate in that we're going to ask you the same question. So you've already heard this question, but let me repeat it, that we just want to know, what do you think is the most important thing that you've accomplished in your scientific and conservation career?
I would guess that it is the realization of how important endocrinology could be to answering certain basic questions about the biology of species. Because when I started, it was really clear that we knew almost nothing about basic biology. And so we also sort of stumbled on the idea that we could measure hormones non-invasively. So we could now collect fecal samples or urine samples and actually track reproductive cycles and look at stress hormones and that sort of thing in animals without even touching them. And so it was right at the very beginning of that kind of work was being done, and we kind of drove it forward. And then did a lot of training. Once that became popular, a lot of people wanted to learn how to do it. So our lab became kind of a central hub for training people how to do that. And then it sort of fit into a lot of different disciplines.
And I think we may have gotten some of the ideas to do non-invasive DNA work from following your lead on that as well.
Yes.
I guess also I was going to ask about Jo Gale, if you thought that what her most important contributions were.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jo Gale and I had kind of a similar track in that I relied a lot initially on the tool of endocrinology. And when Jo Gale came on, she had the tool of, laparoscopy, for example. So I always said that endocrinology to me is, you have animals that are breeding or not breeding and you don't know why, but like endocrinology can shine a light inside the animal and tell you what's happening actually inside the animal. Well, Jo Gale actually had a tool that did have a light that she could put in the animal and actually look at the reproductive organs and things like that. So she used that tool in a fantastic way to create all kinds of different assisted reproductive techniques, artificial insemination and embryo transfer, and really pushed forward the work of reproductive physiologists. So we both relied on really important tools.
Yeah, you both were very much, and also Kathy and Deborah, pioneers in this whole area. I'm going to ask a longer question now, first to Kathy, and then we'll ask it to Janine as well. And this one is about the challenges that you may have faced as you tried to move forward in your career, doing research and conserving biodiversity. Reflecting on those now, do you feel that any of those challenges were specific to you as a woman in science? Did you consciously seek and find strategies to overcome these roadblocks? And can you give some examples of how you might have employed these strategies?
Oh my goodness. So the beginning of it was problems I encountered.
Yes, what problems did you encounter? It's a multi-part.
Well, I encountered, starting off with my father, who didn't believe girls should go to college. And then my high school counselor, who didn't think Stanford admitted women. And then this went on, this kind of thing. At Harvard, somebody asked me how I was going to be taking care of my children. And I applied for a lot of university jobs and didn't get one, which I think was probably due to the fact that I was a woman. And so I spent about 10 years in postdoc and other kind of positions until I finally got a job at the Smithsonian. And then I really just blossomed, and I didn't have much problem after that.
Do you think the Smithsonian environment was different in some way, or?
It was the John Eisenberg environment. I don't know about the whole Smithsonian.
Okay, well that's good. He was also
he knew talent when he saw it. Well. He didn't like administration, so he hired scientists he thought would do something without much supervision.
Yeah, it's academic freedom too there. So it's good.
Yeah.
And then Janine, same question for you. If you would like to answer the challenges you've faced in your career, and reflecting on those, were there any that were specific to you as a woman in science? Did you seek and find strategies to overcome these roadblocks, and some examples?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think growing up when I did, and the culture, the kind of male-dominated culture when I was going to school, and especially since I picked animal sciences as a discipline, which was practically all men at the time, I sort of learned how to be a good old boy myself. I mean, it was sort of a good old boy culture, and I sort of decided right then and there, PC didn't exist back then, and I figured I was gonna go with the best of them. So to keep up with the boys, and didn't give them any reason to, criticize me as being a girl. And in a way, I think that was really good for me because, I stood up for myself, and I didn't let little things kind of get to me. And I think the only disappointment that I faced when I got to the Smithsonian was when I was hired. I was hired with two other men, and kind of similar backgrounds, years post PhD, that sort of thing. And they were both hired at 1 and 2 grades higher than me. So I've always been sort of trying to catch up financially. And I was told straight away that, well, you're a woman and you're married, so you don't have to earn the same amount of money as a guy. So that was like my first experience when I got to the Smithsonian. But quite frankly, since that time, I have not found it to be a particular challenge in doing what I want to do. And I don't think being a woman has really held me back after that.
That's good to hear that we're doing something right here at the
Yep.
Smithsonian. We have, I think, run out of time now. Kate, do you have any last things you wanted to say?
I think if that's the case, I really love the metaphors and the insights that you've provided. And so to quote Deborah once again, I think we're done.
Thank you very much, Kathy and Janine.
Excellent. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Wow, thank you. What a great conversation. Next, we will be hearing from 6 experts on overcoming gender-based obstacles to conservation biology and social science. Let's listen to them.
Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining our panel on overcoming gender-based obstacles in conservation science. I'm Mel Songer, a conservation biologist with the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute and National Zoo. I really had a blast organizing this with my friends and colleagues, Dr. Nutrin Songsason, who we'll hear more from in just a minute, and environmental historian, Dr. Kate Kristen. When we started brainstorming about this call, in the midst of being shut down and facing societal crises on multiple fronts, we thought, why don't we try to lighten things up and talk about something like the age-old battle against gender discrimination? But seriously, with these 45 minutes, we want to provide an opportunity for recognizing the obstacles that women, non-binary, and trans individuals face in the field of conservation. These challenges range from unequal pay, fewer opportunities for promotion, even harassment, to more subtle exclusions and microaggressions. We recognize that when gender intersects race and ethnicity, that these challenges only multiply. Even so, women and other marginalized genders have been making critical contributions to the understanding, protection, and conservation of natural resources at community, national, and international levels for a long time. Our goal is to talk about various experiences of inequity in conservation, as well as highlight successes scored in creating change and promoting equality. Our fantastic panelists come from a range of disciplines and are at different stages in their careers to bring diverse perspective and experiences to our discussion. Some I've known for years, and some I've only had the opportunity to meet through this event. They are all inspiring to me, and I'm excited for you to hear from them today. They're part of a groundswell of researchers innovating new ways for women and other marginalized genders in conservation. So I'll briefly introduce them before I dive in. Apologies in advance, it's hard to represent all they do in 2 quick slides. First, Dr. Daniela Chavez is a Smithsonian postdoctoral fellow with the Center for Species Survival at SCBI. Her mission is preserving rare genotypes of endangered cat species. Daniela develops novel, cost-effective methods for storing genetically valuable gametes and preserves them through cryopreservation for the Smithsonian Genome Resource Bank. Daniela works with several groups to promote equality, including the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos, Hispanics, and Native Americans in Science, the National Zoo's Diversity Committee, and the Association of Minority Zoo Professionals. She also mentors the next generation of scientists with the goal of making science education accessible to everyone. Her formal education is from the University of Utah and the Evergreen State College. Dr. Gwenaria Isaac is curator of North American ethnology at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. Her mission is to increase understanding of Native American knowledge systems, knowledge diversity, and the dynamics of intersecting cultural systems. Gwenaria has developed a methodological platform for synthesizing research on the production of new knowledge within endangered languages. And she collaborates with community scholars through Smithsonian's Recovering Voices initiative. Her fieldwork is based at a Pueblo of Zuni Tribal Museum in New Mexico. Gwenaria has also developed programming on how museums can revitalize endangered languages and knowledge. Her formal education is from Oxford University and the University of Michigan. Dr. Alex Moore is a National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellow, jointly appointed at the Center for Biodiversity Conservation and the Education Department of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Their mission is focused on developing research and education to support equitable management for healthy wetland ecosystems by conducting research on predator-prey relations within the Pacific Islands, and incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion perspectives in exploring social and cultural implications of habitat restoration and conservation. Alex also teaches conservation biology to high school students in the museum's after-school program and coordinates the education department's science research mentoring program. Their formal education is from Yale University and the University of Michigan. Dr. Suzanne Murray is head of the Smithsonian Global Health Program at SCBI. Her mission is to combat emerging infectious diseases that impact endangered wildlife by providing clinical care to free-ranging wildlife and by leading research and capacity building of international health professionals working at the human, wildlife, and domestic animal interface. Suzanne is SCBI's Chief Wildlife Veterinary Medicine Officer and Smithsonian's liaison to the White House's Office of Science and Technology Committee on Pandemic Preparedness. Her formal education is from Tufts University and Amherst College. Last but not least, Dr. Nutrin Songsason is head of the Center for Species Survival at SCBI. Her mission is to ensure sustainability of canids in zoos and the wild. Nutrin leads the Global Canid Conservation Program. She innovates reproductive technologies for conservation and builds governmental and NGO partnerships to address threats. Nutrin also leads and advises international committees on canids, including the IUCN's Canid Specialist Group, the Dole Working Group, the Maned Wolf Species Survival Plan, and the Canid Taxon Advisory Group. Her formal education is from Kesasart University in Thailand and the University of Guelph in Canada. So welcome to all of you. I'm so thrilled for the chance to speak with you on critical and very timely topics. Currently, we're seeing real time how the shutdown is disproportionately affecting women professionally. You know, mothers are 3 times more likely than dads to take on caregiving now that kids are staying at home. And in September, nearly 8 times the number of women dropped out of the workforce compared to men. And the rate is even worse for minorities. Of the 13,000 submissions to medical journals on COVID research, only 1/3 were submitted by women authors. And we know that when women aren't represented in science, it has a ripple effect on our health and support for our issues. And that's even more true for marginalized genders such as non-binary and trans individuals. Now, for me personally, I have a 2-mom household. So my wife and I split the work pretty evenly. And I highly recommend that if any of you out there are maybe considering it for the first time due to the crisis. But anyway, to kick off the panel, I'll be asking questions for 30 minutes, followed by a brief wrap up on strategies and recommendations that I've compiled from this group. And I'd like to start with a bit of a lightning round by asking each of you to address the same question, then getting into more specifics as well as strategies and successes in the next round. First question is, what challenges have you faced related to bias in conservation science? And once again, please address this in brief. And in interest of equity, I'm going to start in alphabetical order. And a reminder, panelists, if you'd like to follow on somebody's comments, just raise your virtual hand and I'll turn it over to you as time allows. So we're going to start with Daniela.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges for me has been really to keep all of the pieces of my identity intact. So I come from a very multicultural background. I was born and raised in Salt Lake City, which has a culture in and of itself. My family is also Mexican and Costa Rican. And so I think navigating the culture of academia on top of those things has been, a pretty big challenge. And I think that I am sort of the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the scientists in the next generation that are going to be facing these same kinds of challenges. I think what I found for myself, and I really didn't recognize it until I heard actually another Latino scientist mention, was that I have found myself sort of downplaying certain parts of my culture and my identity and trying to highlight other parts as I come through to navigate. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges. And for people like me also who didn't really have, help paying for college, we have a lot of family obligations that are on top of outreach efforts that we also do. So I think sort of this cultural battle is one of the biggest challenges that I've faced.
Thank you. Next up, Gwen.
So as a cultural anthropologist, the area that I work in is the intersection of different knowledge systems. And science is just one of those knowledge systems. So in my work, and I work in the Southwest in the United States, in the Pueblo of Zuni, it's become really clear the difficulties of people who have knowledge, environmental knowledge. How does that intersect with science? So that's one of the areas that I work in. And to give and one of the problems is that the way things are currently structured is often Indigenous perspectives are not included in the way in which we conceive of science. It's often limiting towards those perspectives. So one of the stories that I wanted to share was in the last 5 years, there was a group of us that were working together on health, environment, and Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. And we were putting a piece together for a journal about the importance of bringing all of those together: human health, environmental health, traditional knowledge, and then having that work and bridge with many of the sort of the scientific frameworks that that are in practice. And in order to get this into a journal, we went through various review series where people were reading this and giving us feedback. And we found that almost 60% of the reviewers for this science journal were writing back and saying that they felt that what the Native scholars had contributed was not science, but was folklore or lore. And it took us 4 years to finally get through the review process. But the good side to that was that that's one of the articles that is I find of work that I've done has been most read, because I think actually people were really interested in the topic. But the downside to it was that I think many of the Native scholars I was working with were really concerned that their contributions was constantly being called lore and not science or traditional ecological knowledge. So that's been the challenge, is finding ways to bring the different knowledges together and to integrate Indigenous perspectives within our science.
Thank you. Next, Alex.
Yeah, thinking about this question, I think for me, on a more personal note, that my most influential challenges, I think I would say, are surrounded this idea that the research and the field are not necessarily representative of who I am as a person. And so I think I have entered these spaces recognizing that, the idea is to focus on the research and having things be very empirical and doing well in those regards. But I find that for me, I care far more about making sure that I'm able to bring my whole self and all of my interests into my work and in the spaces that I work in. And so I think it's been a little bit of a challenge to push back against this idea that I go to work or I've gone to school to just be an academic as opposed to trying to be a full human being. And so I've done a lot now in terms of sort of making sure all of these different parts of me are a part of my work and a part of the spaces that I'm in. But in terms of, initial challenge, I definitely would say that it was incredibly isolating to realize that I was only able to really bring one or two parts of myself into certain spaces and do well. But not really be able to see my whole person in those spaces and share that kind of experience with other people. And so I think, that was, I think, a big one that I think still carries on even into today. But that's a challenge that I think, we don't talk too much about, but I think is really important to think about.
Thank you. And next is Suzanne.
Hi. I think that one of my biggest challenges is being able to find my own voice and have the opportunity to speak and represent my work, as opposed to having someone else being able to do that. And also being recognized as an expert in my field. For the last 10 years, we've been looking at human and animal health globally. That's why we have the Global Health Program. And in particular, for the last 5 years, we've been studying coronaviruses and COVID in particular. And I've been asked to, I'm recognized as an expert by those outside of our institution. So I've been asked to speak at the World Economic Forum, the European Union. I've been asked to speak to Congress. I just spoke to the foreign animal disease threats last week, to the reports up to the White House. I've been labeled a global visionary by the USB Bank and an explorer by National Geographic. So there's a lot of folks from outside who recognize not just me, but our whole team and what we've been able to do. But yet internally, I feel like when there's a chance to brief people on our teams or Smithsonian on COVID, my voice and our team's voices are often not heard, or we're not considered an expert either, because we're from inside, or perhaps because of gender.
Thank you. And Nooch?
Thank you, Mel. I think for me, the challenge would be a combination of Daniela and Suzanne. First, I just want to point out that, I've been with Smithsonian for some time, and I have seen a movement to where women leaderships have become into this leadership position more so than when I started at the Smithsonian almost 20 years ago. So that's good news. So we have in a high level leaderships, and also someone like myself, we're going to have these leadership positions. So that's good news. But not so good news, and something that we need to improve on, is that include women in conversation, just like what Suzanne said. Even I'm the center head, have this center head position, but sometimes in the room gathering by all the gentlemen, and then I feel like the gentlemen just seem to talk among themselves and forget that you are also in the room and also part of that discussion. So inclusion is one of the big challenge. And I feel that as a woman, that's also the challenge for a woman, but for someone that come from different culture, from Thailand, I also from Thailand, we are quite reserved, and we not, by nature, I'm not an outspoken person. So I'm already soft-spoken. So that also compound with being a Thai and being a woman among all these gentlemen leadership who's, quite rambunctious and want to get that thought out. And then sometimes I just feel that I didn't have a chance or been given a chance to speak or discuss in some of this decision making. And I'll just leave it that for now.
So I'd like to do now some sort of targeted questions to get into more detail from each of you, starting with Suzanne. You've been at Smithsonian for nearly 20 years, and you've already talked about how being an expert on coronavirus, it's really been incredible to see how your expertise has been so critical at this time. We're all sitting in separate rooms instead of together because of this. And
exactly. Yeah.
I wonder about, when we spoke, you mentioned in the early days being the only woman in the room, and now you've come so far. And I wonder if you could reflect on changes you've seen in terms of bias, progress, and any sort of solutions or strategies or successes that you've seen through those many years.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. Yeah, when I was first a student here over 20 years ago, I was definitely the only female student. And I was also told at that point, you can't pursue this job. You can't do this and have a family. It's going to be one or the other. And I was also asked in my early years who would your mentors be? And I remember thinking at that point, I don't know that I have a mentor. I don't know there's anybody that looks like me that's above me. I've always reported to all men and all males. And I've kind of paid attention as the times have changed, and how wonderful it is. And I've also recognized, I think, the importance of representation, and not just in gender, representation on anything, for young girls, young women to see folks that look like them, and how powerful that can be. So I think that's one of the things for almost any underrepresented voice, to see somebody that looks, sounds, appears like you. So that's one of the things that I didn't realize would be quite so important. It was actually here that after I was at the Smithsonian that There were two really strong, warm, smart, supportive, but women that Evelyn Lieberman and Eva Pell, that I just thought, wow. I mean, they can, they lead, they're smart, they're strong, they're warm, they support others. Like, that's what I want to be. So, and interestingly, I'm also raising a young teenager, a very thoughtful young woman. And when I talk to her and folks in the younger generation about their frustrations, I say, well, hey, it's so much better than it used to be. And I love their approach, because they're like, that's not good enough. There's no reason to judge someone on their sexual orientation, their color, their gender, anything like that. Like, it all needs to stop now. And I'm like, wow, these kids are powerful. And so anyways, those are some of the things I've noticed, that the approach has changed a lot. And I think it's the fact that we're having this, this panel of terrific, smart, strong women. I think it's one of the paths forward. And a shout out to you guys for making this happen.
Thank you. And I want to say thank you too for being a role model for me.
Oh, really? Oh, Mel, that means a lot. Thank you.
So going on to another crisis that we're currently facing as a country, it's not a new crisis, but it's one that we're really kind of newly realizing in the mainstream, I think, and that's the systematic racism in our society. So I'd like to ask Alex to address this, as well as the challenge of being part of a marginalized gender. And Alex, you're really living at this intersection of society's biases around race and gender. And you tell us more about your experiences, if you've found successful strategies, and also, what changes you'd like to see from either us as individuals or institutionally to try to promote quality and inclusion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a tricky question, because, we're highlighting this moment as if this moment is somehow different from other moments. But I think this moment is really just louder than previous moments. So we have this history. And so this, for me, has been, my life from the beginning till now. And so it's really just about being open to communicating it, finding ways to feel safe and engaging in the conversations and the conflicts that arise. And so, my experience in it has been a lot of, I guess I would say, making myself small, especially earlier in my education, was really sort of making myself small and fitting into these spaces and making sure that I didn't stand out in ways that might somehow come across as detrimental to really anyone in that space. I think there's a lot of sensitivity around how you should behave in shared spaces, especially as a person of color. And so I found that, at least as I went through my education and into my work, I've done a lot more of really emphasizing that I shouldn't need to make myself smaller to fit into the spaces that I go into, and trying to make that very clear to other people who also want to be in those spaces, that we really shouldn't have to conform, we really shouldn't have to shrink. The spaces really should be accommodating to all of us. And if it's not, then those are spaces that honestly should maybe be torn down and built into spaces that are more accepting and equitable and inclusive for everyone involved. And so I think in terms of advice, it's a little bit tricky, right? On the one hand, at least for people who look like me, I think the advice I would give is to take risks that feel safe for you to take. And I think that's really the most you can ask of people, because you never really know what they're going to come up against and what kind of pressures or dangers that might exist in certain spaces. So really only take those risks that you feel like you can take safely. And I think for others, I think it really looks like, taking a step back and sort of being quiet and listening and trying to hear these stories, and then realize the role that you might play and what that person's life history may have been, what that person's current experience may be, and be willing to take that criticism, not personally, but really as an opportunity for you to, make changes, do things that you think will help move that space forward. But really try to take ownership of your role if you have privilege and power in those spaces, and to use those things, because not everyone does. And it's the people who do that really have the most ability to make those changes more accessible and open for other people.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And that's something I've definitely I've tried to, really tried to do better, is listen and not just assume. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about this. Another recent event, we've recently celebrated Indigenous Peoples Day, which is also known as Columbus Day. And, while it's encouraging to see this sort of outpouring of support to change the focus of this longstanding holiday, it's also kind of amazing that it's taken this long. And so when as an anthropologist studying Indigenous cultures, I wonder what changes you've seen through the years, and also what kind of recommendations you have to help individuals and institutions to value and include Indigenous and specifically Indigenous women's perspectives.
Thank you. So it's a really good question. I started at the Smithsonian very much probably sort of 25 years ago as a researcher coming and working on collections. So the difference between then in the sort of 1990s and now is really quite commendable. A lot has changed. I think that the concept of working collaboratively and through partnerships with communities in general is much better recognized than it was in the sort of the early 1990s, where we were just having things like repatriation come in, where there was even still a battleground about that, and now that is a space that's very much understood as collaborative and in partnership, or at least that's the sort of best practice. And I came to the Smithsonian because there was a program that had just been set up called Recovering Voices, which was entirely that. It is a collaborative space. It's designed to work in partnership with Indigenous scholars and communities and help with language revitalization and cultural knowledge revitalization. And one of our central points within that has been knowledge about the environment and health, sort of One Health. And we've learned a huge amount from the communities that are working with us. But I think it's good to then look in the future. Where could we go? Where could we do better in this area? And one of the things that I feel is that there are a lot of women at the Smithsonian who run programs, and they're recognized, and these programs are sort of helping solve some of these inclusive issues of inclusivity. But one of the things that I think we could do more is have women in these positions of thought leadership, where that position then is also very much integrated. And this is to build on what Suzanne's saying, integrated into how institutions then share the work that they're doing. Because you can run your own program, but if you're not then able to communicate outside of that institution or beyond into the world, then you don't make the institutional changes that are required. So I would love to see the women who are running these programs be, on the Smithsonian Channel, be, on the front of magazines, be on the radio shows, and really given that position of like, this is someone in a thought leadership position. And then, the younger generation sees that and they feel strong about, where we're headed. To give you a good example, when my daughter was younger, we loved watching nature programs, science programs. And then for a while, she kind of backed off and cooled off. And she said, I'm tired of watching shows in which there's a man telling us what's going on with a row of women behind him at microscopes or, doing whatever they're doing. And she kept pointing it out to me. And I honestly hadn't seen it until she pointed it out. And now it's this trope that we laugh about. But so I would like to see that switch, and have women be the spokesperson and really, celebrate that position for all the wonderful work that they're doing. So, yeah.
Thank you. I think with this panel, we're kind of illustrating one of your points about the kind of silozation in Smithsonian. We have you that work on One Health issues, as well as Suzanne, and yet you've never met before or even know of each other. So it's kind of interesting.
I know I'm listening to what you're saying, and I'm thinking like you're right on, and again, how brilliant for your daughter and how observant, and that's what we need to be raising, right? These young ladies who it needs to be about us and about them.
Yeah.
So speaking of different cultures, some of our panelists have perspective really deeply rooted in other countries, and Nisha, I wonder, will you talk more about your experience as an immigrant to the U.S., whether you face bias for not being born American, and also differences in bias maybe between your countries. What thoughts you have on trying to overcome these biases?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been moved to the United States in 2000, so it's 20 years now since I've been in this country, and now also hold a dual citizenship, so Thai and American. So I think that at the beginning, before came to the US, I had these naive ideas of, how people in the third world, like my country, or the developing country, like Thailand, looking at America as a developed country. And I was shocked to learn that there's women in United States facing the same challenge as the women in Thailand, unequal pay in some, and actually sometimes more, because in the discipline of science, women scientists in Thailand are doing very well, but in the US, unequal pay is one of the big issues. So I was surprised when I first moved here that this is actually happened in the great United States of America. So that was, and then on a personal level, by being come from other country and people, I had to work much harder to be accepted, as because I don't speak English. English is not my language, so I can speak English, but not, like you guys speak English. And I have accent, and people often making fun of my accent, which I thought it was beautiful accent. But I noticed that when compared to my colleagues, my male colleagues that also have accent, they seem to be more, and the people seem to accept them more than me. So I feel like either I'm a woman, or maybe the Thai accent is different, or people just not used to that. So I don't know. So so I've been, I used to feel sad and discouraged sometimes. But then I realized that only thing that can change that and can change the outlook of my career is myself. So I use that, any critiques, comments, anything about my being a Thai, turn it around to be a positive pressure, like a drive for me for my career. So I feel that, I want to thank all the people who critique me with good intention or not so good intention. Thank you, because of those critique has brought me to this day for my success in my career. So I think for those out there who facing challenges, I think, don't let those challenges walk you down. Turn it around into the positive direction, and then give it a push into your career, whatever you want to do in your life, because you carry your own destiny. And being from Thailand, and another interesting is that I kind of trapped in this cultural bubble, because living in America for 20 years, I'm not a typical Thai anymore, but I'm also not a typical American either. So I kind of in this little bubble of half Thai, half American. So sometimes people just, I just sometimes feel weird because you're not being accepted in any country, but it's fine. So I'm just, do the best as I can.
Thank you. I just would say you are a great example of turning it around, and it's great to see you now in the leadership role, running the center. It's been really exciting. Daniela, you mentioned your family coming from Mexico and Costa Rica and being deeply rooted there. It sounds like you might even consider Salt Lake City another country as well. I'm not sure, but I wonder if you'll tell us more about your experience, what that's meant for your career, successes or strategies you'd like to share about overcoming some of these challenges.
Absolutely. It's, I really echo what Noosh says, is that you know, it's difficult to find kind of where you fit in after, you know, going through all of that. You find that, or I've found that, you know, now that I've, you know, gotten my PhD and now I'm a postdoc, it's not only do I still find myself trying to figure out how I fit in here, but in the academic world, but also sort of at home, because your identity shifts. You know, graduate school is such an intense experience that it shifts. And, you know, I very much feel like a Latina. I feel that I'm Mexican. I feel that I'm Costa Rican. I've spent a good amount of time in Costa Rica. And I feel very much that I'm a Utah girl. And honestly, I have tried to look at it as, you know, an asset, that I can sort of speak the cultural language of a lot of different people. And I think that that, you know, has been really helpful, but it's taken, you know, a good amount of work. I would say the first few years of graduate school, I really struggled. And the biggest sort of thing that I think that I could give to people is to let them know that you have got to find a community, because having a group of people that are in kind of the same boat as you is extremely essential. For me in graduate school, that was the Saknaf community, as you mentioned. I was the president of the chapter at the University of Utah for a while. And that was really helpful. And now, you know, that I'm here at the zoo, I participate in these other groups. And I think that that is just critical. That's the only way to go about it. At least it was for me. And I think secondly is taking care of myself physically. It's something that scientists don't talk about a lot, and we're very good at putting our, you know, own physical and mental well-being on the back burner. And so I think that's, you know, really, really important as well.
That's a really good point. A lot of times I think as scientists, we work so hard, we don't sleep, we feel stressed, and we don't really think about how that impacts our lives as well. So that's a really good point. So I just want to thank you all for your openness and candor. Unfortunately, due to time, we just have enough time for a short statement from each of you before we move to the recommendations that we put together.
Yeah, so I think the last thing that I would have to say is to just encourage women to, you know, be yourselves as soon as possible, as soon as you can feel comfortable. We spend too much time, you know, trying to be other things. And I think that, you know, would have been helpful and I could just fail faster.
So my advice to young women out there, and especially young students, you know, from diverse communities, is that you're not the problem. You are the solution. That our world is going to be a much better place if you join us, because your knowledge is so important to how we will fix some of the problems that we have. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that I would end with saying that for anyone entering new spaces, you know, don't change yourself to fit into that space. You know, try to make sure that that space can change to fit what it is that you need. And so that's what I would end with for people.
I would close with saying that diversity, collaboration, inclusion is powerful. It's an asset to our institution. We need to represent ourselves, and we need to represent other previously underrepresented voices. Thank you so much.
Well, I think that since everybody already got what I had in my head, so I think my closing gonna be invite all the gentlemen to join us to support women leader and recognize that we also have a strong voice. We have ability as much as you do. So let's make it equal and working together.
Great, thank you. So I just want to wrap up with recommendations that we've compiled from the panelists and organizers. And the first slide is about institutional recommendations. That as an institution, we should include and recognize expertise and work done by underrepresented groups in leadership, and highlight those that strive to include underrepresented voices. We need to build institutional pathways for work bridging science, social science, art, and humanities, and really think of it, the natural world, as an interactive system experienced through multiple means. And finally, prioritize, speak about, and support the physical and mental well-being of women and underrepresented individuals. As an institution and as an individuals, recommendations are to make diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice integral to the work and not simply an anecdote or broader implications. Include diversity of cultural knowledges in science and consider the diversity of cultural knowledges of how science is conceived. And invest time and energy in finding community people in which you feel heard and valued, both within your professional sphere and outside of it, and institutions should be supporting these communities. And then finally, as individuals, we need to support each other, mentor younger generations of women and marginalized genders, encourage women and marginalized genders to take opportunities, to showcase themselves as role models, share their stories, demonstrate the diversity of their career paths. And finally, if you have privilege, power, and a platform, amplify the voices of those who are regularly silenced. And I hope that's what we've been able to do today with our panel. And I just want to say thanks again for the panelists for your insights, for the risks that you take in speaking out. Thanks to the American Women's History Initiative for this opportunity, and thanks to everyone for joining.
Thank you. Let's keep the day going. Next, we will have a lightning talk with Dr. Allison Tracy as our moderator. She will be discussing Women Scientists of the Future, Smithsonian Interns and Their Paths Through a Changing Scientific World. Dr. Tracy, take it away.
Hello, my name is Allison Tracy, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, also known as STRI. I'd like to welcome you to Women Scientists of the Future, Smithsonian Interns and Their Paths Through a Changing Scientific World. In this mini symposium, you'll be hearing from 4 stellar Smithsonian interns who conducted research at STRI. The participation of interns in scientific research at the Smithsonian is a valuable contribution to our work and to science as a whole. Our goal here is to recognize these important contributions on a larger stage directly in the voices of these interns, who will help build the scientific world of the future. The 4 speakers will talk about their diverse research topics and broader interests, providing a glimpse of the role the Smithsonian can play as an early step in the career of young scientists. We'll be hearing from Skye Austin, Matilda Newcomb, Amy Tien, and Corinne Knapp. With that, I'd like to thank my co-organizer, Allison Kaywood, the Citizen Science Coordinator at STRI, and turn it over to the first of our wonderful speakers.
Hello, today I'm going to be telling you about my internship with the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center and my lab mates and I project on the effect of excess nitrogen on native species. My name is Skye Austin. I'm a sophomore environmental studies major at Shenandoah University. I'm in my school's honors college, the Environmental Club, and I play a varsity esport. In my free time, I enjoy doing things like knitting and crocheting, keeping aquariums and terrariums, and I'm a proud plant parent. This internship allowed me to do what I love in a scientific context. Going big picture for a moment here with this diagram, you can see that there are cities, agricultural areas, and suburban areas. All of these areas produce runoff, and this runoff will hopefully be going into a native ecosystem. And there are many interactions that go on within a native ecosystem, but my lab mates and I decided to focus on these that you can see here in this diagram. There's the interaction between the plant community and the soil community, so how the microbes and fungi and bugs in the soil affect the plants, how the soil nutrients affect the soil community, so what the soil community is putting into and taking out of the soil, and what I'm interested in and what I will be talking about today, which is the bolded arrows, and that's the interaction between the plant community and soil nutrients. So how much nitrogen, for example, is in the soil, whether it's too much or too little or just the right amount, and how that affects the plant community. And all of these interactions and many more affect what go into our streams and other important waterways. This internship was originally supposed to be in person, with me going to the CERC facility and conducting field work there. But when everything went remote, my lab mates and I decided that we wanted to do something where we could do field work in our own yards. And so we came up with this experimental design where we could test all of our questions and find out what we wanted to know. So our experimental design looked a little like this. We had 60 pots in our yards, and there were 2 plants in each pot. These plants could either be the same species or different species. And these plants were pulled from a pool of 3 species, which were the Joe Pye weed, Virginia wild rye, and the sensitive partridge pea. There were 2 different treatments: the runoff-based treatment, so what the amounts of nitrogen would be in runoff, and the control treatment, which had no nitrogen. We had 5 replicates of each treatment, and it went on for about 4 weeks. One of the plants, which you can see here in the bottom right corner, the sensitive partridge pea, was of particular interest because of its nitrogen fixing abilities. This means that it has a special relationship with bacteria in the soil that allow it to gain a bit of an advantage because it has access to nitrogen that other plants don't have. So for our results so far, we found that the sensitive partridge pea grew better in the control treatment, which you can see on the left-hand side, than it did in the excess nitrogen treatment, which you can see on the right-hand side. So what does all this mean? Our excessive use of pesticides and fertilizers affects our environment in a detrimental way. It can cause something called eutrophication, which is when all of the nitrogen that goes into the aquatic areas causes a lot of plant growth, and this plant growth takes oxygen from the water. And when it does that, it doesn't allow things like fish and crustaceans to survive. And when this happens in an area like the Chesapeake, and there are industries that rely on these aquatic animals for businesses, it not only detrimentally affects our environment, but it affects us too. So if we can perfect this riparian system to clean up our waterways and improve our environment, it will not only be good for the environment, but be good for us as well. I firmly believe that the system has so much potential, and I can't wait to see what the future holds. I would like to thank all these people and organizations for making this absolutely amazing experience happen, and thank you for coming to my presentation today.
Hi, my name is Matilda Newcomb, and I interned at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center in the summer of 2018 and 2019. My project, I worked in the Marine Disease Ecology Lab, and I had the privilege of working on a project involving Perkinsus marinus and oyster disease in the Chesapeake Bay. And then I was able to present my findings at a conference in the fall of 2019. And the data from my project is in the works of being published in a paper this fall. So talking a little bit about the background of my project is oysters. Oysters are considered ecosystem engineers, so they're important in the building blocks of ecosystems. They do this first by providing nurseries for fish and also filtering sediment and other smaller organisms out of the water, creating the water so that it's clean and clear for other animals to live. So what I specifically looked at was an oyster disease called Perkinsus marinus, or more commonly known in the Chesapeake Bay area as dermo. As you can see in my presentation, there's a slide showing the oyster tissue, and all of the black dots are Perkinsus marinus cells. So starting in the 1950s, there was an overall decline in the oyster population from dredging, human interaction, and destruction of oyster reefs. However, disease also highly contributed to this because the disease is prevalent in the water column, meaning in the water itself. So the oysters, as they're filtering sediment, they will also filter in dermo, which will then infect their cells, multiply, and deteriorate the overall health of the oyster, eventually leading to its mortality. So this is really important because oysters throughout their entire life that they're diseased will be infecting other oysters, and then upon death will explode a lot of cells into the water column and release and infect all the other oysters on their reef. So what I wanted to look at was transmission of the disease within the eastern oyster. So as we know, this looks on a seasonal scale like a few things. 2 things affect oysters and the transmission and the prevalence of this disease. The first is temperature, and the second is salinity, how salty the water is. So the hotter it is and the saltier the water, the more intense the disease transmission will be for oysters and among reefs. So we've only really looked at this on a seasonal time scale. So as you can see in this graph, there are spikes in August, mostly, and in early summer. So that's the hottest part of the year, which yields the highest salinity. So this has only been looked at on a seasonal time period. So what I specifically wanted to look at was what was the daily release of perkinsus into the water column. And so really how many cells are released into the water over a 24-hour period. So this is really interesting because it'll tell us a few things about reef migration of the disease. And as scientists, one of the best times to study this disease and collect cells for this disease. And also it'll tell us a little bit about how climate change will affect the oysters and oyster reefs and disease on a daily time schedule. So my experiment was a mesocosm experiment, meaning it was an isolatory kind of baby aquarium experiment for oysters. So I had 18 oysters, and I actually ran my experiment twice, but the most successful run was the second one. So I had 3 salinities, low, medium, and high. So as I mentioned, both salinity and temperature are important in the prevalence of this disease. So then the oysters and the aquariums, as you can see in this picture on the right, were set outside in the Chesapeake, next to the Chesapeake Bay, to experience the overall changes, natural changes in temperature throughout the day. So these were also sampled every 6 hours. As sampling, what we did is we took the water from the oyster container and we filtered it through a filter, and we were hoping that cells from the disease were caught on the filter and thus could be looked at on a slide in order to evaluate how many disease cells were being released by the oyster over a 24-hour period. So the conclusions from my experiment was, looking at this, it's kind of hard to tell from the graph, but there was a large spike at 6 p.m. when we sampled. That means that during the hottest part of the day, from 12 to 3 p.m., there was the greatest release of cells. Also, we learned from our experiment that salinity wasn't highly impactful and was not significant in prevalence of disease. So what this means, it tells us a couple things. The first is that temperature is truly the motivating factor for the release of the disease over a 24-hour period, and potentially over a seasonal period as well. And that salinity probably has more to do with the multiplication of disease rather than the actual release of the disease. So this tells us a few things. It tells us about which are the best sampling times, so 12 to 3 p.m. It tells us a little bit about reef migration, and it tells us mostly how impactful climate change is going to be to this disease and the multiplication of this disease and the intensity of this disease in the next couple of years. So as the water gets hotter, specifically in rivers like the Road River where I was working, there's going to be a more impactful release of disease and intensity within the oyster populations. So this tells us a lot about how impactful climate change is going to be in the next couple of years to oysters. So I'm really interested in climate change, and I hope that this experiment will tell you a little bit about how disease is affecting the oysters in specifically the Chesapeake Bay and overall natural oyster populations. Thank you so much for coming to my talk, and I really appreciate your time. And I hope you learned a little bit about oysters and disease. Thank you.
My name is Amy, and I'm a senior at the University of Chicago studying biology and public policy. In the future, I aspire to be a scientific advisor and researcher that helps people find solutions to ecological and conservation issues. This summer, I was an intern in the terrestrial ecology lab at STRI, researching the drivers of public interest in invasive plants and how we can use the internet to better understand how we interact with the environment. So let's begin. Imagine that you're an alien that has no idea what is happening on Earth right now in 2020. And since you're far away, you decide to look at what humans are searching on the internet to see if you can figure it out. A spike for searches in toilet paper delivery? What is Zoom in March 2020? Of course, these charts are not surprising to us as we live through COVID-19, but to the outside observer, this search data helped tell a story of humans and their environment. The internet is increasingly being used by people to gain knowledge, and thus search data can become a really useful tool to understand knowledge gaps in environmental issues. And understanding public attitudes on environmental issues is essential because societies tend to protect what they recognize as important, which can lead to more conservation action. For instance, climate change and invasive species are interrelated issues and act together to reduce biodiversity. However, invasive species receive much less public attention than climate change, according to a recent study, which can be a hindrance for conservation. And so our question is, what drives public interest in invasive species? Here we are using invasive plants as a case study to examine this question. If we can understand what makes the public interested in science topics, then we can find ways to better educate the public and improve public action on pressing issues. So we hypothesized that 3 things might help influence interest. local occurrences of invasive plants, plant traits, and media coverage and tone of the articles written about invasive plants. So we collected these data from a variety of botanical and species occurrence databases and conducted a media analysis using a list of 217 invasive plant species in the US. And to quantify interest, we looked at the Google Trends data of all 217 species on our list for a 10-year period from 2010 to 2020. And we synthesized all these layers of data together and examined the relationships between our 3 factors of interest and Google Trends data to understand the drivers of public interest in invasive plants. So in our results, we found that only 156 of the plants on our list had Google Trends data available. So around a fourth of the species had either no or too little Google searches over the past 10 years, despite being the top most abundant and noxious invasives in the US. And this was surprising because there are common invaders, and it seems like the general public isn't aware of a significant portion of them. Additionally, we concluded that public interest in invasive plants is driven mostly by media coverage and tone, and secondarily by proximity and plant traits. In other words, the more articles that are written about invasive plant species and the stronger the tone of the article, the higher the interest that people will have. And this was interesting because factors we thought were important, such as local occurrence and plant traits, were less important to generating interest. And thus, some interesting implications of our work emphasizes the need for science writing and communication on invasive plants and other science topics, and possibly writing some articles that have a stronger tone without spreading misinformation. And with greater public knowledge, we can prevent planting invasives in our gardens, take action by removing invasives, and influence policymakers by advocating to stop the spread, such as preventing them from being sold easily online. And as ecologists, these results were pretty interesting because we may think that human-nature interactions occur physically, which motivated us to examine the proximity and plant traits. However, our results demonstrate that they are also driven digitally, as we found interest in invasive plants was driven mostly by media coverage and tone. So from our study, we anticipate that using internet search data can be used to identify ways to improve public awareness on environmental topics and inspire people to take action on pressing issues. So as a CERC intern this summer, I learned how to reason and justify our method choices in our research, to be more confident in my abilities as an inspiring researcher, and the importance of clear and engaging science communication with many groups of people. And so I have all of these great people and organizations to thank, and also you for your attention, and I hope you learned some interesting things about how we interact with the environment through my presentation.
Hi everyone, my name is Corinne, and I'm excited to share with you all some of the research looking at living shoreline restorations in San Francisco Bay, happening in part with CERC. So a little bit about me. I'm born and raised in Southern California, and my love for the ocean began back in my surf competition days. My interest with living shorelines began as an undergraduate at USC, where I studied sediments at one such restoration, and I'm pictured here holding one of the many samples we collected. As an intern working with CERC West this summer, I had the opportunity to continue studying living shoreline restorations in San Francisco, and was even able to do some field work following COVID regulations. I'm currently a master's student pursuing my degree in interdisciplinary marine and estuarine sciences at San Francisco State, and will continue to work with the Smithsonian. So a little bit of background. Our shorelines are increasingly threatened by flooding and erosion, and some of the solutions to this problem are shown here. On the right, we have some of our more conventional mitigation techniques, which are known as hard armoring, and these involve structures such as seawalls or bulkheads, and these dramatically change the landscape of our coast, cause the loss of natural habitat, and can negatively affect native biodiversity. Living shorelines, on the other hand, offer a nature-based solution that incorporate native vegetation, shellfish, and other natural structures to help prevent shoreline erosion, as well as benefit and restore coastal ecosystems. In California, some of these living shorelines incorporate the native Olympia oyster, which is shown here. These oysters help improve water quality, are a food source, and create low-profile reefs that are important habitat in the intertidal and subtidal zones, giving them the distinction of being an ecosystem engineer. In San Francisco Bay, Oysters are limited by a lack of hard substrate that they need to settle on. And we can see this where oysters have even settled on a deflated basketball shown here, which was found at the site that was later chosen to be the San Francisco Bay Living Shoreline project at Giant Marsh that I worked on as an intern. At Giant Marsh, oyster habitat was restored constructing these oyster blocks made of sand, oyster shell, and concrete. Scientists at STRI are using these blocks to not only encourage the recruitment of native oysters, but are also taking the opportunity to investigate a new restoration technique utilizing rockweed, a brown macroalga common in San Francisco Bay. Much like trees in a forest, macroalgal canopies are foundation species that can keep conditions cooler and more humid. This is especially of interest when considering thermal stress in the intertidal zone. During high tides, organisms are protected by the ocean, which acts like a sunscreen, separating them from drier and warmer air conditions that they are subjected to during low tides. In these low tides, microhabitats created by rockweed canopies can offer protection from that thermal stress. In working with STRI, my project studied the ability of these canopies to modify the environment and found that rockweed significantly alleviates stressful conditions during immersion. Under rockweed, we found conditions about 8 degrees cooler and 36% more humid, and it also outperformed another seaweed species that we had compared it to. We also explored if artificial materials could replicate this, and found that terry cloth rag could mimic conditions if immediate rockweed restoration isn't successful. Moving forward, the project will look to study the biological consequences of these microhabitats underneath rockweed, and specifically we're excited to see how it could affect and potentially benefit Olympia oysters. As a graduate student, I'm looking forward to apply what I learned about nature-based solutions to seawalls when living shoreline restorations aren't an option. Thank you for listening, and thank you to STRI West for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. That was such a great session on our Smithsonian interns. Our next panel is Mujeres de STRI, From Exclusion to Influence, Women's Role in the Making of a Scientific Community at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute.
Thank you for joining us to discuss Mujeres de STRI, From Exclusion to Influence, Women's Role in the Making of a Scientific Community at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. Today, we'll explore how female mentorship was a key strategy to advancing women in science, yet a group of mainly Panamanian women who contributed significantly to the creation of STRI, a premier U.S. tropical biology research platform, remains unrecognized. My name is Hannah Byrne, and my fellow moderator, Adriana Bilgray, and I are so fortunate to be joined by this group of women: Mercedes Arroyo, Georgina de Alba, Elena Lombardo, and Gloria Maggiore. All of our panelists began their careers with STRI in the 1960s and 70s, and served in integral positions of administration and education for over 30 years. We'll hear these women share their experiences and discuss how their contributions kept the research community agile and afloat through difficult times at STRI. We will explore the role of female mentorship and learn a little more about what it was like to work with one of the first female administrators hired at STRI, Adela Gomez. A native Panamanian, Gomez was essential to the operations, stability, and development of STRI from 1945 to 1984 and worked closely with all of our panelists today. We would like to start with a short video to familiarize you with this history.
In 1903, the U.S. signed a treaty with Panama to build the Panama Canal. Concerned about the environmental impact on tropical forests, the Smithsonian launched the Panama Biological Survey in 1910. But when Smithsonian Secretary Charles Walcott was asked if botanist Agnes Chase could join the expedition, he said no, expressing his reluctance to send a woman on a mission of this kind. In 1914, the Panama Canal opened to great fanfare. U.S. scientists working in Panama created the Institute for Research in Tropical America and called for the largest island in the canal to be set aside as a biological reserve. This group celebrated the inauguration of Barro Colorado Island Research Station in 1923. Entomologist James Seatek became station director. Female researchers could visit for the day, but in response to a request for a women's dormitory, botanist David Fairchild wrote, "Let us keep a place where real research men can find quiet, keen intellectual stimulation and freedom from any outside distraction." And so it was until the 1950s. However, Panamanian women began to leave their own legacy. One of the many island trails bore a woman's name, Nemesia, for the station cook Nemesia Rodriguez. After World War II, the Smithsonian Institution became the island's official custodian. James CITEC hired Adela Gomez as clerk typist and Alcira Mejia as librarian. When CITEC fell ill for an extended period, Adela Gomez wrote to Washington, "You may rest assured that I will take care of everything." In 1956, the Smithsonian appointed evolutionary biologist Martin Moynihan as director. He hired the first full-time staff scientists from the US who moved to the island with their families. The presence of women and children changed the nature of the community, creating a family atmosphere. In 1966, the Smithsonian Institution officially created the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, or STRI, to direct tropical studies in Panama and around the world. Additional local staff were hired and marine research stations were created on the Pacific and Atlantic coasts. Adela Gomez brought women like Gloria Mayori and Mercedes Arroyo to help with crucial administrative tasks. Marine biologist Ira Rubinoff, who succeeded Moynihan as director in 1974, participated in the Panama Canal Treaties, which initiated a process to turn over sovereignty of the canal to Panama. STRI's Office of Education, led by Georgina de Alba, began a fellowship and internship program and reached out to local schools. Then, in 1989, the U.S. military invaded Panama and deposed General Manuel Noriega. Administrator Elena Lombardo and others helped to keep STRI afloat during these tumultuous times, and organized the inauguration of STRI's Earl Stopper Center in 1990. Today, much of what we understand about life in the American tropics is based on STRI contributions. Almost 14,000 scientific publications describe complex tropical forests and coral reefs. Now STRI hosts over 1,000 visiting scientists and students from 50 countries each year, roughly half of whom are women. Although only 1 in 4 of STRI's permanent staff scientists are women, due to the legacy of the women we will meet today and reorganization by recent directors, Panamanian women continue to hold their own, both as researchers and administrators of the Institute. In 2020, Dr. Ori Sanjur became the first female scientist to direct STRI for an extended period of time. In this role, she has continued to push forward our mission.
So that was one version of STRI's history. And now I'd like to welcome Mercedes, Georgina, Elena, and Gloria to hear their stories. Thank you all for joining us today. So the Panama Canal Zone was a strip of land 10 miles wide along the Panama Canal that was a U.S. territory from 1903 until 1979. And the Canal Zone Biological Area, which later became the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, was a U.S. institution. So can you tell us about how did you come to work there and why did you take the job? Gloria, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Thank you, Hannah. I came to what was the Canal Zone Biological Area in 1961 because Mrs. Adela Gomez was a close friend of the family, and she knew that I was bilingual and I was not working at the time, and she needed really quickly a replacement to the only clerical assistant that she had at the time, who was taking leave. So I said, sure. I had never worked before, but I think I'll enjoy doing something like this and not just raising a family. So I went to work, and the work consisted of clerical work, which included going to the Canal Zone post office to pick up mail, and also going to buy heads of bananas at the Chinese garden to take to the train station to be delivered to Frijoles Station, where a boat would take them to BCI for the monkeys. And that was basically it. And I worked for about a month, and I really enjoyed the interaction out of my home all the time, taking care of the family. And then this was Libet, and I liked it very much. Then I started thinking about what was important about what was happening at BCI. Why were scientists interested in coming to work in hot, rainy Panama? And in time, I grew to understand that what they were doing was something that they wanted to do. They wanted to do research in tropical biology, and here we were. So with that understanding came my knowledge of what they were doing and the respect for what they were doing. They loved their work. And that, I think, influenced me, besides the fact that Mrs. Gomez was so dedicated to the Smithsonian at the time, Canal Zone Biological Area. that I felt this is what I want to do as well. And I want to love what I do, and I want to show them that I love what I'm doing and help in every way that I can. And I think that that's about my introduction to STRI at the time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gloria, for sharing with us. It's incredible to hear about STRI in those early years. Mercedes, would you like to share next?
Well, I came to STRI through the Central Employment Office under the Canal San Mary system. I received a call from Mrs. Adela Gomez, which was STRI's administrator. She had to interview me. This interview was at the third floor of the Ancon Courthouse building, which was the main office at that time. She explained what the job was, 5 days a week under Dr. Austin Stanley Grant's guidance. My eagerness, my curiosity, and interest were probably the reasons why I accepted the job. It was at that time a very, very good decision. With Dr. Rance being my mentor, I first learned of the work and the importance of what was being done at STRI. I began to love nature and the environment. I first learned of the work with Dr. Rand, as I said before, and Mrs. Gomez. Having Mrs. Gomez as my direct supervisor, she not only influenced my career, but my entire life. I am sure her influence was felt in the rest of the community, both scientific and administrative. She was the perfect picture of that line in our job descriptions that said other duties as assigned. She was an administrator, an accountant, a procurement person, an international ambassador. Her involvement with relations with the U.S. and Panamanian authority was very impressive. Adela Gomez was not only an excellent administrator, but most important, she was an extraordinary human being. A person that anybody that knew her, well, we will remember her as a role model. She was an extraordinary example of a person.
Thank you, Mercedes. It's incredible to hear about Adela Gomez. Next, Elena, would you like to share?
Thank you, Hannah. Yes, I came to STRI because I was also in a list of people eligible to do administrative tasks under the civil service system that at that time existed in the former canal zone. So it was a U.S. system. I was in a list. Mrs. Gomez called me, and I was selected from the eligible person on that list. The meeting with her was really inspirational because she, as Mercedes is saying, was a very, very impressive person in terms of her dedication to the institution, her love for what she did, and you could tell that she was totally immersed in trying to help and do anything that was for the good of the advancement of science at that time. She was my mentor, and I worked with her for many years, all the way until she retired in 1984. I started in 1969. And as Mercedes was saying, she was a role model, and I think she inspired many of us when we started first to follow her steps and her dedication as a Smithsonian employee, and also taught us about the importance of science and in helping to advance scientific programs both locally and internationally. Her diplomacy was very, very well received by the many people she had to deal with, because she was very well known with people at the U.S. Army, U.S. Navy, and the Panama Canal, which at that time were our main supporters in our work. Being Barro Colorado Island in the center of the canal, it was important that we maintain good relations with all those that were related to operating the Panama Canal.
Lastly, Georgina, would you like to tell us a little bit about your journey to STRI?
Thank you, Hannah. I was teaching Spanish to a group of scientists, and my name came on a list of potential candidates for a temporary job in procurement. It was to replace Mercedes, who was the office head and was going on maternity leave. I was interviewed and hired. The work was very varied, buying supplies, equipment, food, and whatever was needed for BCI that we had to call by radio. My boss was new and could not give me much direction. So I had to read the files, and with a little help from my two co-workers, I survived and learned a lot. Adela Gomez then spoke to me about a more permanent position as her administrative assistant in the director's office, working with Ira Rubinoff and Elena. But I would have to wait a few weeks to hear more about it. And in the meantime, I found out that I was pregnant with my first child. When I went to the interview, the first thing I said to Mrs. Gomez was that I was pregnant. She asked me if I was planning to return to work after I had the baby, and I told her I was. I was elated when I received the call that I had been given the position. I will always be grateful to Adela Gomez for hiring me. From her example, I learned the real meaning of facilitating research. I always admired her long-term dedication and service to the institution. I took the STRI job without hesitation. It was 1977, the new Panama Canal treaties were being signed, and I knew that in the director's office, I would learn a great deal. I would be working with persons who knew the institution well, Adela Gomez, Ira Rubinoff, and liked what they did. Another positive factor was to work for the Smithsonian, an institution that I had visited as a student. From the very beginning, I knew that STRI was the right place for me.
Thank you all so much for sharing. It's incredible to hear about STRI during this time and to hear about Adela Gomez's impact with all of you. Next, I'd like to ask Gloria, when you first started in 1961, what is now STRI was still the Canal Zone biological area. Can you give us one example of how the organization changed over time to adapt to changing conditions, and maybe one example of something that hasn't changed?
Okay. Between 1961, when I first came, and to 1971, in that span of time, I came to STRI several times to replace, but only for temporary positions. Like if somebody was going on leave, I would come and work for 2 weeks or a month or so. Then in 1971, Mrs. Gomez called me to tell me that Elena Lombardo was going to be married and was going to go for a couple of months. And would I be interested in coming again? And so I was in the right place at the right time, and I said, yes, of course, I would want to come back. Then I came back, and I stayed. And I stayed, and I stayed, and I stayed. The growth of STRI was very fast. We not only grew in scientific staff and administrative staff, but also in facilities. And we had new labs being established in terrestrial areas and also in marine areas. And with this increase in facilities, came an avalanche of visiting scientists. And that avalanche is what I was dealing with. I was asked to form and manage the new Visitor Services Office. And I was given the choice of 2 people to work with me. And we were all people. So we worked very well together. What did we do? We made it easy for the visitor to come and to spend his time doing his research rather than having to handle little things, paperwork, and other things that we could do for them. We did things like find housing for them, mainly in our own facilities. We also found them workspace. We found that they had the necessary equipment and transportation. We handled other things that were required by the location of where we were, sometimes in the canal zone, sometimes with Panamanian authorities. We, for instance, transmitted the information to them, and they would get canal zone or Panamanian visa or entry permits. We would then also help them to get the exit permits so that they could leave. And we did other things, very important things like handling research permits. Panama required that they be aware of what was going on and that they authorize what was going on with our visiting researchers. And the paperwork was kind of involved, trying to explain to some of the authorities about exactly what it was to collect this or to, take these to the lab. Sometimes we had to go with the scientist and be the interpreter or the translator because of the language barrier. And it was very interesting, it was different, and there was never a dull moment. It was very, very informative for me. I felt that I grew as a person by doing all these activities. I grew to respect the scientists for what they were doing, and they grew to respect me for what I was doing for them. This acknowledgement was very rewarding to me, and that is what made me love STRI and love my work.
Thank you so much, Gloria. Now, Mercedes, throughout your career, first as a secretary and then head of the procurement department, and now as STRI's customs broker, you have made sure that STRI scientists have always had what they need to do their work. Can you give us 1 or 2 examples of maybe strange or difficult items that you had to procure, import, or export, and how you handled the situation?
Okay. My career at STRI was full of challenges and excitement. I can tell you that. From transcribing materials to the production of a scientific manuscript, working at the accounting department. But most important was the purchases of supplies and equipment for permanent and all the hundreds of visiting scientists. They had a very short period of time, so that had to be done efficiently and quickly. An example, dry ice that was needed to send research samples to either part of the world. It had to be produced. It was not an over-the-counter thing that you could buy. One day that we were needing the ice dry, I ordered it. And the following day, the company called us saying, sorry, our equipment broke, so I cannot give you anything. It then became an emergency. I started, to be creative. And the first thing I thought, airport used a dry ice, so I'm going to call them. No results. So I had to search around, talk to people, and I found out that the Gorgeous Memorial Lab produced their own dry ice. So I went over there, explained our situation, and they were able to produce the ice that was needed right away. but they took like a day to do it. But it was in time for us to deliver to the airport the samples that were being sent elsewhere. During my time, it was, and the girls will know, were periods of political unrest, uncertainty, and our process of getting things done made it very hard for us to obtain it in an amount of time. The process of purchasing, importing, and exporting became very, very difficult. After the invasion took place in December, I was calling on the 23rd to purchase supplies that would need it for all the STRI community. I went to the office, and the first thing I saw before reaching my destination was a big tank of a U.S. military people. And with my ID card, I was able to reach to my destination. But we spent some days purchasing, preparing packages, and distributing them to the STRI community. I cannot tell you how we felt. It's an experience that will never be forgotten by us, by our families, and everybody that was involved in this. And I can go on, telling you all the story of the hundreds of things that happened during that time. It was very, very difficult. After the invasion and all the things that we had to undergo, what we got was a recognition from Dr. Runoff saying that we had done an exceptional services. And I feel so grateful that all our efforts and all the things we had to do was being appreciated by the persons that we had to serve. We had a sense of gratitude. It was how do you call it? Something that you're so glad to do, and you are being recognized for it.
Thank you so much, Mercedes. Now I'd like to turn it over to my co-moderator, Adriana.
I am delighted to share a virtual stage with a group of incredible women. An important part of STRI's mission is to train the next generation of tropical scientists. Georgina, you and I share a common interest. Can you please tell us about how you shaped education outreach offerings as STRI grew from a small organization in the Canal Zone to a major international platform for the study of tropical biology?
Thank you, Adriana. In the 80s, as educational coordinator, I worked closely with the board of scientists and our director to expand opportunities for the next generation. In addition to the Smithsonian-wide programs, we were able to secure stable funding for graduate students to conduct 3-month projects with a STRI advisor. This program really hooked numerous young men and women in tropical research. We expanded our fellowships and internship program for finishing undergraduates, since local universities did not have graduate studies at that time. Numerous participants from Panama and other countries in the region, many of them women, received valuable hands-on research experience and mentoring from our scientists. Many Panamanian biologists were introduced to STRI through this program. And one example of this is our acting director, Ori Sanjur. The expansion of these opportunities opened doors for the next generation of tropical researchers. In the 90s, with the opening of the new Tupper Center, local interest in our activities increased. I was then part of a team that included Adriana, and I became more involved in outreach. With several colleagues, we planned and opened the Culebra Nature Center, a very natural area that was close to our marine labs. We envisioned Culebra as an outdoor classroom to learn about nature at the site. Once I was there when a group of students visited from a town in the mountains, and they had never seen the ocean. They were thrilled touching starfish and learning about the fish and sloths they had seen. We were opening students' eyes to their unique natural heritage. When I started at STRI, we were some 60 employees, and it really felt like a family. Several decades later, my last years as associate director, we were more than 400, working at 7 facilities and joined each year by several hundreds of visiting researchers. Through the years, we have become more open and diverse, with more women, Panamanians, and other nationalities on the scientific staff. Visiting researchers and students came from different countries and states in the US. The Institute had become a leader in tropical research, and employees felt very proud of what we had achieved.
Thank you so much, Georgina. It is indeed rewarding to see people grow and to know that you have been part of it, at least a small part or a big part. Panama is our host country. Elena, how did your skill as liaison between STRI and the Panamanian government ensure that scientists could keep working even when tensions between the US and Panamanian governments were high?
Thank you, Adriana. First of all, I always understood that research, especially the type of research carried at STRI, was long-term, and that it could not be stopped and taken over again. It was long-term research. So with that in mind, in the very stressful years we had before the invasion, not during, because the invasion per se was only about 4 days, but the previous years where the political situation between Panama and the relations with the United States were very, very tense, involved me in trying to keep the military regime informed of what we were doing, where and when. So every person, every scientist who was in the field doing research throughout the Isthmus of Panama, in very sometimes difficult areas, mountains, forests, etc., had to carry a letter from me explaining what they were doing and the equipment that they were carrying, because at that time it was very sensitive to be carrying binoculars, for example. Everybody was suspicious of everybody else, and our people were doing their very different kind of work that people had to understand. It was always respected, and in that letter, the explanation was what the person was doing, what equipment they were carrying, and that if they had any problems, please call me. So that means that I was really stressed for many years before the invasion, trying to make sure that our people were safe, that they were continuing, and they were able to continue to do what they were doing in whatever different environments they were working, whether marine or terrestrial. I found that communicating and being in touch with the people who were in power all the way from General Noriega down, and letting them know where we were and what we were doing really was helpful, and they really respected our work once they understood what it was all about. At one time, in the Causeway, when we have the marine lab, somebody had to study when the moon was full and it was midnight. And I had to explain what happened at midnight and why they had to go and observe the behavior of a crab. That was the time when the crab came out of its nest, and they were just interested, and they were respectful, and always then authorized for us to enter different areas that were at that time very sensitive and very much close to the public. So I found that talking to people, explaining to them, and maintaining the communication channels open was very useful, and resulted in our being left out of the political turmoil that was going on at that time. They permitted us to continue with our work. Nobody was arrested or taken into custody. And as I said, if they had any questions, they would call me. I would explain. And the Smithsonian was well respected. So the work, regardless of the tensions and regardless of the political situation where even the US Embassy had to close, the Peace Corps had to leave, and other US interests were really not welcome, they would not obstruct the continuing work and research of STRI.
Thank you so much, Elena. If you could give a new employee at STRI one piece of advice, what would that be, Mercedes?
Okay, with my experience at STRI, I learned that life is a process of learning. You know, I had to learn from the military language, which was my first work at the Army Air Force Base in Albrook. Change that ship to the scientific language, which I can appreciate what the scientists did to make my job easier. You never stop that process. An example of that, because with all the problems we were having with the relations with Panama, the way we have to import and export things, that we have to be creative, we had to depend on other people's willingness to help us. It was good that the relations was handled by Elena, Georgina, make things easier for me, easier for all the rest of the crew that was working on getting all the supplies that was needed for STRI. It was not an easy job. Sometimes you could go to the airport to pick up, and there was a person taking pictures and saying, these people belong to the CIA. It was very, very scary. But what I would say, when you think you have reached your goals, you find out that there are more things that you can do. You have to learn about your institution or any organization that you're going to enter. Be part of it. Don't be an island. You have to increase your sense of belonging. This is very, very important. I'm still active in my career and my community environment. I get involved with things that can be done, things that can be improved. And I work very, very much with children in schoolrooms, teaching them to love the environment, love nature, and we have been very fortunate to have the 5 directors that we had, the supervisors, the co-workers. We worked as a teamwork. And this is very important, very important. You are not an island. Everybody needs you and you need everybody. Dealing with the hundreds of persons that we have dealt during the years of the performance of our duties, we were lucky to have good persons that surrounded us. In other words, treat others the way you would like to be treated. This is very, very important in the performance of your job, with your family, with the community, and with nature. Recycle, reuse, and reduce.
Thank you so much, Mercedes. Regina, what would be your advice?
Well, one important piece of advice I would give a new employee would be respect others in the institution and to earn their respect by your actions. In my early years, I learned the importance of respecting others and being respected from the example of my mentors. They were considerate, hardworking, and dedicated. They helped others like myself succeed. It was not just because of a position title that they were so highly regarded. They were respected for how they treated others and for their actions that helped move the institution forward. It's a wonderful opportunity really to be able to work in a place like STRI with persons from various cultures doing different types of work. But in such a diverse, multicultural environment, respecting others becomes even more important. I saw it through all my STRI years. Examples are the women I have shared this session with. Respect is key to becoming a successful STRI employee.
Thank you so much, Georgina. Elena, what would your advice be?
Really, I would tell them since right off the first day, you are lucky to have this opportunity to work for such a unique institution. But they do have to understand the bigger picture of STRI and the Smithsonian. It's not only STRI and what you're doing in your job, it's what you belong to, your part, like in a puzzle. You are an important part of that big puzzle. And so try to read the history, for example, of the Smithsonian, how it all started. That is really unique, and it puts you into a feeling that it's different. It's not political. It's not a matter of parties. It's not a matter of business. It's something for the world. It's something for culture, for knowledge. If the people start the first day by understanding and getting a briefing of what this is all about and what you're working for, I would really recommend that they get and really understand the bigger picture of the Smithsonian. They have to be flexible because this is an institution where I can say that for 45 years, I was never bored or have a dull moment. So that means that you never know what's going to happen next. And that includes many positions with many situations that are pretty unique. So I would, again, emphasize on briefing because sometimes some employees come in and they don't have a clue what is it that they're doing apart from their day-to-day work. And they need to be really briefed on past history, both of, and also to feel very proud that they're part, Smithsonian in Panama is part of the Smithsonian in Washington. That's very important Because if you feel only, well, here I am in Panama working for STRI, and you don't understand that you're part of a bigger and very reputable institution, you're missing half of the admiration that you could have and the proud of the position that you are at that time doing. Also, be very flexible. Tell people to be flexible because things have evolved. The technology has changed, and you have to be prepared to be ready for the changes that are occurring every day. So persons have to be flexible in learning and understand that this is an ongoing effort, and what is it that they're contributing to. Very important that the employee understands. The sooner, the better. So they feel really, really part of this major enterprise, which is Smithsonian, and it is worldwide. So their job and the repercussions, the publications, the research that come out of STRI, it's all for the world, for knowledge. It doesn't belong to somebody in particular. And so you're working for something that is really important in the way of how the world is developing and every day acquiring new knowledge for the better of humanity. They have to know that since the very beginning. They'll feel very, very proud.
Thank you so much, Elena. Gloria, would you like to share your advice?
Sure, Adriana. I think that most of the panelists here have already covered what I would say myself. I think that having worked at STRI for so long, I want to sort of focus on what it is that makes working satisfactory. The first thing is love your work. Do not work for the money. If you don't love your work, you will be unhappy, and an unhappy person is not a good employee. I think that the best thing to do is to give what is the best of your ability. You don't have to be Superman nor Superwoman. You just have to know that you have done the best that you can, and people recognize that. You also have to show respect to your coworkers, to the visitors that come, to the staff. And when you show them respect, you'll get respect back. And that is, I think, one of the major important things to have when you are an employee, respect. And another thing is to receive the recognition of the researchers, for instance, was very important to me. I grew at STRI. I grew from a very young woman to a worker, to a mother, and then to almost a person that was unrecognizable to me. I did not think at the beginning that I was going to be able to handle some of the challenges, and little by little I did, but I didn't do it alone. I did it because I worked with people that were fantastic, starting with Mrs. Gomez, who was an incredible example, and all of my coworkers who were also helpful to me as I tried to be helpful to them. To finish up, I think that the only thing more I can say is to give to the best of yourself, and you will receive the best from them. I was, and I am, and always will be a part of STRI. This was my second family, and I loved it.
Thank you so much, Gloria. I could not agree with you, with all of you. Know your history, learn from it, respect others, and have an impeccable work ethic. Do what you love and do it with passion. I think we have to live by these principles because people look up to you, people look up to us, and you never know who you might be inspiring. STRI is a gem, indeed, no doubt. It is absolutely a crown jewel. And I'm quoting Ruth Ginsburg here. Women belong in all places where decisions are being made. There you go. In 45 minutes, we have traveled through time and taken you on a journey through STRI's history, narrated by 4 amazing ladies who have inspired so many. If you ever had the privilege of working with them, you would understand me when I say they lift people up to their highest potential. They led by example, the example of remarkable women like Adela Gomez. During prior conversations with them, similar phrases came up over and over again. Phrases like, STRI was like family. We were like sisters. There was a sense of pride and belonging. It felt like home. Well, you know, home is where the heart is. Their contributions throughout their years of service at STRI have been invaluable, and we stand on your shoulders. Muchísimas gracias de todo corazón a Georgina, Gloria, Elena, and Mercedes. We too shall lead by your example. Have a good evening and stay safe. Thank you.
How wonderful to hear from all the women about their past experiences at STRI. This concludes the second day of our virtual symposium, American Women of Science. We'd like to thank all our panelists, and thanks to all of you for tuning in and watching today. We hope you can join us tomorrow, same time, same place. If you are joining our networking session, please use the Zoom link you received via email. And whether you are joining our networking session or not, please enjoy your evening.
My name's Nancy Knowlton. I'm a marine scientist here at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. And I study coral reefs and actually just everything that lives in the ocean. I've really been interested in science for pretty much as long as I can remember. When I was in college, I was still interested in biology, but I didn't actually know the kind of biology I was interested in. And in fact, I think my least favorite courses were about the topics I work on now. But after I graduated from college, I spent a year working in the laboratory of Dr. Ruth Turner. She was a marine biologist. She was the first woman to go down to the deep sea in Alvin, a very famous submersible, which is actually still used today. And she really inspired me, and that's how I went from being a general purpose biologist to really a committed marine biologist. I started off doing animal behavior on these tiny little snapping shrimp that live with sea anemones. In 1980, Hurricane Allen came and swept by the north coast and really pulverized all the coral reefs and it looked like an underwater parking lot after the hurricane passed through. Really just dropped everything and joined a team of people to figure out what happened as a function of the hurricane and how the reefs would recover. And then that really led into a whole stream of work that eventually led to my conservation work today, and that's because those reefs never did recover. When water gets above about 1 degree centigrade or 2 degrees Fahrenheit over the normal maximum for the area, that symbiotic relationship breaks down and the corals undergo what's called coral bleaching. If it's severe, and it often is, it leads to the death of the coral.
And of course, the future is also not looking too good, especially under a business as usual scenario.
I came to realize that just talking about all the bad things happening to reefs was not going to really change the conversation in a way that needed to be changed.
So I started 7 years ago, and Nancy brought me on to the Ocean Portal team and took me under her wing. As the threat of climate change is continuing to grow, the science that we do here at the museum has to evolve at the same time. We have scientists and researchers in the lab who are using cutting-edge technology to understand the impact of humans on the oceans. Then what I do is I take that science and share it with audiences around the world so that they can understand it.
So next generation sequencing technology is where we sequence millions and millions of strands of DNA at the same time instead of one at a time. That lets us sequence thousands and thousands of marine organisms at once and get a picture of the entire community at once. It's pretty clear that in many cases, biodiversity is linked to healthier ecosystems, right? So ecosystems that do things that are helpful to humans, whether it's making fish for us to eat, or cleaning out the pathogens out of the water, or filtering water. We really need to understand why and how these ecosystems are changing and how that might affect humans in the future.
So I went from studying snapping shrimp, living with sea anemones, to studying the effects of a hurricane, to studying the fact that there were many more species of corals out there than people realized. And that's been the story of my whole career, one discovery leading to another, and almost impossible to predict. And those changes were inspired by things I saw underwater, events that happened. Makes you wake up every morning and be excited just by the beauty, in addition to, of course, all the cool scientific questions you can ask.